Hi, welcome to the Hurricane Utah Adult Religion class, sponsored by the Hurricane Utah North Stake of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Mike Parker, and since 2008, it's been my privilege to be the instructor for this class. The Hurricane Utah Adult Religion class meets on Thursday evenings between September and May to discuss the scriptures, teachings, and history of the restored Church of Jesus Christ. If you live in or are visiting the Hurricane St. George area, I'd love to have you join us. Time and location are available on the class website. There's a link to that in the show notes just below this video. Also on the class website, you can download my notes, which includes footnotes documenting my sources, this PowerPoint presentation, and handouts that I distribute in class. Please note that this YouTube channel and the class website are not official sites of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Hurricane Utah North Stake, or any other church unit or department. I alone am responsible for the content on these sites. What you're about to see is a recording of my notes for one of the lessons. If you enjoy this video, please click the like button and share it with a friend. And please feel free to subscribe if you'd like to be notified when new content is posted to this channel. My friends, the gospel of Jesus Christ is true. Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, and the authority and keys that he held are now vested in the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And most importantly, Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the Savior of the world. I hope you enjoy this lesson. The revelations in this week's reading are connected to Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible. We'll begin by answering some of the questions that are frequently asked about his translation effort. Question 1. Why did Joseph Smith make a translation of the Bible? Joseph made a translation of the Bible because the Lord directed him to do so. In the prophet's manuscript history for November 1831, immediately before the revelation that is now section 71, he dictated, quote, "I resumed the translation of the scriptures and continued to labor in this branch of my calling with Elder Sidney Rigdon as my scribe," unquote. Although there is no record of a revelation specifically directing Joseph to make a translation of the Bible, the translation effort is mentioned numerous times in Joseph's revelations, his journals and other papers, and in the church histories he directed. Question 2. How did Joseph produce his translation of the Bible? The translation was not done in the usual manner of a scholar. It was a revelatory experience using only an English Bible. The prophet owned a large family-sized edition of the King James Bible. He and Oliver Cowdery purchased it in Palmyra, New York in October 1829. Joseph read from this Bible and dictated his revisions and additions to a scribe. His scribes wrote on sheets of paper that were collected into manuscripts. At first, Joseph would dictate the entire text of each verse, along with his revisions. He later switched to a simpler, faster system of marking his Bible where changes should be made, and having the scribe record only the changes rather than the entire verse. The 4 manuscripts that resulted from the translation effort comprise a total of 391 pages, plus the changes marked in Joseph's Bible. Sidney Rigdon was Joseph's principal scribe during the translation effort. 5 other scribes also wrote for the prophet, including Joseph's wife, Emma Hale Smith. Joseph's own handwriting is also found on 4 of the manuscript pages. The translation was accomplished by divine revelation to the mind of the prophet Joseph. Like Joseph's other revelations, the translation process was not a simple mechanical recording of divine dictation, but rather consisted of study and thought, accompanied and prompted by revelation from the Spirit. Unlike the translation of the Book of Mormon, there is no evidence that Joseph used a seer stone or the Nephite interpreters during the Bible translation. As far as we know, Joseph Smith did not use biblical Hebrew or Greek languages or manuscripts during the translation project. Question 3. How many changes did Joseph make to the text of the King James Version of the Bible? Joseph made changes to at least 3,410 verses of the Bible. That's nearly 11% of its verses. These changes vary not only from the King James text, but also from all other English Bible translations. The changes consist of additions, deletions, rearrangements, and other alterations that range from minor details like the insertion of a single word to insertions of lengthy material that runs several chapters. Although he made no changes to some books of the Bible, Joseph did give consideration to every book from Genesis to Revelation. Question 4. How long did the prophet Joseph work on his Bible translation? He worked on the translation somewhat regularly for 3 years. The first portion of the effort was the revelation known as the Vision of Moses, which is now Moses chapter 1 in the Pearl of Great Price. The prophet received this in June 1830, 2 months after the church was organized. Joseph then proceeded to work through the book of Genesis, starting with chapter 1 and reaching chapter 24 by March 1831. At that point, the prophet received a revelation instructing him to stop translating the Old Testament and to switch to the New Testament. He began that effort immediately. He finished working on the New Testament in July 1832. He then returned to the Old Testament, picking up with Genesis 24 and continuing through Malachi, which he reached in early July 1833. Question 5. Did Joseph finish his translation of the Bible? In a letter he dictated on the 2nd of July, 1833, the prophet stated that he had that day finished the translation of the Bible. After that date, he made no further changes to the manuscripts. All available contemporary evidence indicates that he considered the work of translation completed. Question 6. Did Joseph intend to publish his Bible translation? Joseph and his associates made numerous statements indicating they intended to publish the translation, and Joseph's revelations state that he was commanded to do so. Lack of adequate financial resources appears to be the significant factor that prevented the prophet from editing and publishing the translation. A few excerpts from the translation were published in church newspapers during the prophet's lifetime. Question 7. What happened to the translation manuscripts after the prophet's death? After Joseph's death in June 1844, the manuscripts and his marked Bible remained in the possession of Emma Smith, his widow. Emma gave the manuscripts to her son, Joseph Smith III, who later became the leader of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1860. The translation materials were kept at the Library Archives of the reorganized church, which changed its name to Community of Christ in 2001. Community of Christ graciously allowed the Joseph Smith papers to image the documents and put them online for anyone to view. In early 2024, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints purchased the translation manuscripts and Joseph Smith's Bible as part of a transaction that also involved several key historic sites. Question 8. What is the proper name for Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible? The work has been known by several names. In Joseph's Revelations, the Lord called it the translation of my scriptures, or the new translation of my holy word. Joseph and his contemporaries called it the New Translation. Joseph Smith III edited the manuscripts and published the New Translation of the Bible in 1867 under the title The Holy Scriptures, translated and corrected by the Spirit of Revelation. In 1936, the title of the RLDS publication was changed to The Holy Scriptures, Inspired Version. The term Joseph Smith Translation, abbreviated JST, was created by BYU professor Robert J. Matthews for the Scripture Committee of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as they were preparing the church's 1979 edition of the Bible. Question 9. Why doesn't the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints use Joseph's translation as its official Bible? This is a complex issue. The primary reason is that the Lord has not directed the Church to replace the King James Version of the Bible with the JST. The Church accepts the work of Joseph Smith as being divinely inspired, and it has canonized two portions of Joseph's new translation. Selections from the Book of Moses and Joseph Smith Matthew are both part of the Pearl of Great Price. Since 1979, the Church has published its own edition of the King James Version of the Bible with hundreds of JST footnotes and an appendix containing longer excerpts. Another reason the JST is not our official Bible is because of enmity between the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the Reorganized Church during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Brigham Young believed that the Reorganized Church had tampered with Joseph's manuscripts and that their published version didn't accurately reflect Joseph's original revisions. This mistrust, along with the fact that our church did not own the copyright to the new translation, kept the Utah Saints from embracing the version printed by the reorganization. It took nearly a century for these attitudes to change. They were reversed in large part because of Elder Bruce R. McConkie's interest in and use of Joseph Smith's translation, along with BYU professor Robert J. Matthews' research on the translation manuscripts in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Finally, from a practical standpoint, adopting the JST as our official Bible would be a stumbling block for many converts. Joining the church would require them to abandon every mainstream Bible translation, including the venerable King James, and accept a translation that no other church uses and that varies from all other English Bibles. In this sense, the King James Bible serves as a connection between our church and the remainder of the Christian world. An editorial published in the Church News in 1974 explained, quote, "The inspired version does not supplant the King James Version as the official church version of the Bible, but the explanations and changes made by the prophet Joseph Smith provide enlightenment and useful commentary on many biblical passages. When the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price offer information relative to biblical interpretation, these should be given preference in writing and teaching. But when these sources of latter-day revelation do not provide significant information, which is available in the inspired version, then this version may be used. The King James Version will, of course, constitute the basic English-speaking Bible text of the Church." Unquote. Question 10. If Joseph Smith's work was based on an English Bible, why is it called a translation? It's called a translation because that's what Joseph Smith and his revelations called it. Joseph often used the words translated and translation to mean something more than the narrow sense of rendering a text from one language into another. He spoke of translation in the broader sense of transmission, referring to copying, editing, adding to, taking from, rephrasing, and interpreting. These are substantially beyond the usual meaning of translation. For example, Joseph said that the Revelation in section 7 was translated from parchment, written and hid up by the Apostle John. The prophet did not have any ancient manuscripts when he received this revelation. Likewise, some Latter-day Saints believe that the Book of Abraham in the Pearl of Great Price was a revelation inspired by the Egyptian papyri Joseph obtained, rather than a translation of writings on the papyri. Rather than calling it a translation, it may be more accurate to refer to the JST as a revision of the English text of the King James Version of the Bible. Question 11. Many ancient biblical manuscripts have been discovered since Joseph Smith's time. Do any of them support Joseph's translation? There are a handful of interesting parallels, but recently discovered biblical manuscripts and modern Bible translations mostly do not have readings like the translation produced by Joseph Smith. Question 12. So, if the prophet's translation is a correction of errors in other Bible translations, why do most of his changes not match known biblical manuscripts? Just because Joseph's new translation was a divinely inspired project does not necessarily imply A, that it was a restoration of the original Bible text, or B, that it is without error. Too many Sunday school discussions over difficult passages in the Bible end with someone quoting the Joseph Smith translation and asserting, "That's the way the Bible originally read." The truth, however, is more nuanced than that. The Joseph Smith translation is many things. Different portions of the work fall into at least 6 categories. 1, restorations of material written by the original authors, but later removed from the Bible. This originates with Nephi's claim that many plain and precious things were removed from the Bible by the great and abominable church. 2, historical events or doctrines that were not recorded by biblical authors, or that were recorded but never included in any collection of scripture and subsequently lost to the world. Joseph Smith indicated that, quote, "From sundry revelations which had been received, it was apparent that many important points touching the salvation of man had been taken from the Bible or lost before it was compiled," unquote. The Enoch material in Moses chapters 5 through 7 may fall into this category. 3, corrections of biblical passages that were in error even in the original writing. 4, inspired commentary by the prophet Joseph that enlarged, elaborated, and adapted biblical passages to a latter-day situation. This may be similar to what Nephi meant by likening the scriptures to himself and his people in their particular circumstances. 5, changes to the wording of the Bible to make it clearer and more understandable for modern readers. 6, harmonizations of conflicting historical details and corrections of apparent contradictions in the KJV text. For example, the Gospel of Matthew records that there was an angel waiting for the women at Jesus' empty tomb, while Mark's Gospel says there was a young man clothed in a long white garment. Luke's Gospel reports that there were 2 men in shining garments, and John's Gospel says there were 2 angels. These are almost certainly the original readings from each Gospel. They are not errors, but merely differences in the resurrection story based on varying traditions the Gospel writers knew. The Joseph Smith translation harmonizes all 4 accounts to read 2 angels. Restoration of original lost text almost certainly accounts for a minority of the changes the prophet Joseph made to the Bible. He did not claim to be restoring some hypothetically perfect biblical text. Rather, he used the existing King James text as a basis for commentary, expansion, and clarification, with particular attention to issues of doctrinal importance for Latter-day Saint readers. This brings us to what I think is a critical point. Joseph Smith did not seem to believe that any version of Scripture was perfect or the final word. For example, in 1838, he stated that the angel Moroni in 1823 quoted the prophecy of Malachi with a little variation from the way it reads in our Bibles. But when Joseph quoted the same passage in an 1842 letter about vicarious baptism for the dead, he wrote, quote, "I might have rendered a plainer translation to this, but it is sufficiently plain to suit my purpose as it stands," unquote. In another instance, Joseph altered Revelation 1, verse 6 in his new translation, but in a June 1844 sermon in Nauvoo, he quoted the King James reading of that verse and said, quote, "It is altogether correct in the translation," unquote. Joseph also translated some Bible passages more than once and produced different results in each attempt. This suggests that Joseph was not restoring a single original reading. In summary, Joseph apparently did not believe there was a perfect original biblical manuscript that he was trying to restore. Instead, he was expanding on the King James text and revealing new concepts that may or may not have been in some of the ancient biblical manuscripts and traditions. Question 13. What is the place of Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible in the larger context of church history? Because of Joseph's translation of the Bible, many important doctrines of the gospel were revealed to the prophet. He translated the Bible not because he already understood the doctrines and knew the answers, but because, through the process and experience of the translation, he discovered new and important truths. Joseph's Bible translation also prompted certain questions that led to revelations, which are now in the Doctrine and Covenants, including the vision of the 3 degrees of glory and other entire sections or portions of sections. We cannot overstate the benefits and influences Joseph Smith's new translation of the Bible had on the education of the prophet and the doctrine of the church. Five sections of the Doctrine and Covenants in this lesson contain revelations given to the prophet as he worked on his translation of the Bible. As he came across Bible passages that were difficult to understand or interpret, he took his questions to the Lord and received inspired interpretations. These revelations are now canonized as Doctrine and Covenants sections 74, 77, 86, 91, and 113. Let's briefly review some of the things we learned from these sections. Section 74 is a revealed explanation of 1 Corinthians 7, verse 14. It was received in New York sometime before February 1831. The circumstances of the reception of this revealed explanation are unknown. Historically, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 14 has been a key passage used to justify the practice of infant baptism, so it's possible that the revelation was connected to a discussion of that passage in the context of the Book of Mormon's rejection of infant baptism. 1 Corinthians is a letter written by the Apostle Paul to the saints in the Greek city of Corinth. In chapter 7, Paul answered several questions relating to marriage. In verses 12 through 16, he dealt with the question of marriage between a Christian and a non-Christian. He counseled the believer to not divorce his or her spouse just because that spouse was not also a believer. He told the Corinthian saints that these part-member marriages are holy and that the children that result from them are not unclean. He then exhorted the Corinthian saints to live in peace with their non-believing spouses, for they may be the instrument of saving, that is to say, converting them. It's necessary to understand that in verse 14, Paul used the terms sanctified and holy the way that Jews understood those terms. Jewish theology divided things into categories of holy and unholy. A first-century Jewish Christian would naturally wonder if his or her marriage was unholy because it was to a non-believer, and if their children were unholy because they were the products of a mixed marriage. Paul answered no to both questions. Similarly, there is nothing unholy in marriages performed today outside the temple between Latter-day Saints and non-Latter-day Saints. Although these marriages are less than ideal, they are still acceptable in the sight of God. Section 74 provides additional context that is not found in 1 Corinthians. Paul gave the Corinthian saints, quote, a commandment, not of the Lord, but of himself, that a believer should not be married to an unbeliever, except the law of Moses should be done away among them, unquote. This included abandoning ritual circumcision of their children. Paul's counsel and Section 74 still apply today. There is nothing forbidden or unholy in marriages performed today outside of the temple between Latter-day Saints and non-Latter-day Saints. Such marriages don't enjoy the blessings of the temple sealing and are more likely to experience differences and divisions between spouses. Those are not reasons to divorce, but an incentive to date and marry within the faith, if possible. Section 77 contains revealed answers to questions about the Book of Revelation. It was received at Hiram, Ohio in March 1832. During the previous month, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon's Bible translation effort had reached the New Testament book of Revelation. Revelation is notable for its symbolic language and metaphorical imagery. Joseph went to the Lord for some clarification of the meaning of the text, and he received the revelation that is now section 77. This revelation is a prophetic question and answer session about John's revelation. Section 77 helps us understand the meaning behind some of the symbols in Revelation. For example, concerning the description of the four beasts in front of the throne of God in Revelation 4, verses 6 through 9, Joseph's revelation explains that they are figurative expressions that represent the glory of the classes of beings in their destined order or sphere of creation in the enjoyment of their eternal felicity, and that their multitude of eyes, which gave them the ability to see everything in front and behind, represent their knowledge, and their wings represent their power to move and act. These symbols point to the truth that God and the divine beings who dwell with him have all knowledge and all power. Verse 6 is an interesting and challenging passage. This is the only verse in the scriptures that seems to explicitly set forth the age of the earth. D&C 77, verse 6, quote, question, what are we to understand by the book which John saw, which was sealed on the back with 7 seals? Answer, we are to understand that it contains the revealed will, mysteries, and the works of God, the hidden things of his economy concerning this earth during the 7,000 years of its continuance, or its temporal existence. Unquote. This verse begins by identifying the scroll in John's vision as containing God's master plan for human history. To understand this passage, we need to define some of its words as they were used when this revelation was given in 1831. The following definitions are from Noah Webster's 1828 American Dictionary of the English Language. Economy refers to the management, regulation, and government of a family or the concerns of a household, or the system of management, general regulation and disposition of the affairs of a state or nation, or of any department of government. Continuance is a holding on or remaining in a particular state or in a course or series. Applied to time, duration, a state of lasting, as the continuance of rain or fair weather for a day or week. Temporal means measured or limited by time, or by this life, or this state of things, having limited existence, opposed to eternal. So the sealed book could be said to contain the hidden things of God's management, regulation, and government of his kingdom on earth during the 7,000 years of its being in this particular state, or pertaining to this state of its existence. There are at least 2 ways to interpret this. A common literal interpretation is that the earth and humankind were created 6,000 years ago, meaning that Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden about 4000 BC. This interpretation is based on the biblical chronology created by Irish Archbishop James Ussher in the 17th century. Ussher calculated that the first day of the creation began at nightfall at the start of Sunday, the 23rd of October, 4004 BC. The earth, therefore, would be only 6,000 years old. Ussher's interpretation has been widely accepted by fundamentalist Christians and a fair number of Latter-day Saints, but it's not the only way to interpret the scriptures. A figurative or non-literal interpretation of D&C 77 verse 6 would account for the following points. The periods of time in each of the 7 seals of the book of Revelation are not strict 1,000-year periods. They are dispensations of varying lengths, some longer than 1,000 years, some shorter. For example, the dispensation of the gospel of Jesus Christ lasted over 1800 years, from his birth and death until the restoration of the gospel through Joseph Smith. This is strengthened by the understanding that the number 1000, as understood by the ancient writers of the Bible, didn't represent an exact amount, 100 times 10, but simply a very large number of any quantity. Similarly, many Latter-day Saints believe that the 6 days of creation were not 6 24-hour days, or even 6 1,000-year periods, but long epochs, perhaps up to millions of years each. Finally, we should consider Nephi's teaching in Helaman 8, verses 17 through 18. Quote, "Yea, and behold, Abraham saw of Christ's coming, and was filled with gladness, and did rejoice. Yea, and behold, I say unto you, that Abraham not only knew of these things, but there were many before the days of Abraham, who were called by the order of God, yea, even after the order of his Son. And this, that it should be shown unto the people a great many thousand years before his coming, that even redemption should come unto them." Unquote. Would 4,000 years before Christ's coming constitute a great many thousand years? Or does a great many imply a much longer period of time? The information in the sealed scroll of Revelation only contained information about the earth pertaining to this state of its existence. Perhaps there was a time before the dispensation of the gospel to Adam, about which the scriptures are silent. The point here is not to force a specific interpretation of D&C 77 verse 6 upon anyone, but rather to consider different possibilities. In the absence of direct revelation about the age of the earth, Latter-day Saints may believe the earth is relatively young, or they may believe it is extremely old. Section 86 was received in Kirtland on the 6th of December, 1832. It's a revealed Latter-day interpretation of Jesus' parable of the wheat and the tares from Matthew chapter 13. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus compared wheat growing in a field to believers in the world, just as it is difficult to tell the difference between wheat and tares, a poisonous weed that looks like wheat until harvest time. It is difficult to distinguish the followers of God from the followers of Satan in this world. In the parable, the division of wheat and tares took place at the harvest. So likewise, good and evil people will be separated at the end of the world when the great judgment of God takes place. In his revision of the Bible, Joseph Smith made 2 changes to Jesus' interpretation of the parable. Section 86, however, reinterpreted the entire parable for a Latter-day Saint audience and setting. In Matthew's version of the parable, the sower of the wheat represents the Son of Man. Section 86 reinterprets it to refer to the New Testament apostles. In both versions, the field is the world. In Matthew, the good seed represents the children of the kingdom. Section 86 does not mention this figure. In both versions, the sower of the tares is the devil, or Satan. In Matthew, the tares are the children of the wicked one, or Satan. Section 86 does not mention this figure. The springing up or sprouting of the grain is not interpreted in Matthew's version. Section 86 identifies it as referring to the last days. This is similar to how Matthew identifies the harvest as the end of the world. Finally, in both texts, the reapers represent the angels, or as the JST adds, the messengers sent of heaven. This is a superb example of how the King James Version, the Joseph Smith translation, and Joseph Smith's revelations sometimes give different interpretations of biblical passages that are each perfectly legitimate in their own context. Notice that the JST didn't change the meaning of the parable at all from the version in the KJV. It struck one word and added a phrase to expand on the meaning of the reapers, but it didn't alter the overall interpretation of the parable of the wheat and the tares. Section 86, however, puts the parable in an entirely new context for Latter-day Saint readers. It identified the choking of the wheat by the tares as the New Testament church being driven into the wilderness, and the sprouting of the wheat and the tares, when they could be discerned one from the other, as the time of Joseph Smith and the restoration of the gospel. So what is the actual meaning of the parable of the wheat and the tares? It can be either, depending on which context you wish to put it in. There's an original meaning found in the KJV with slight modifications by the JST, and a new additional meaning for the saints in the latter days, found in Doctrine and Covenants 86. Section 113 was received at or near Far West, Missouri in late March 1838. Just as Section 86 provided a new interpretation of Jesus' parable of the wheat and the tares, Section 113 took Isaiah's prophecy of scattered Israel and their Messiah and reinterpreted it to refer to Christ and a servant of Christ who will help gather Israel in the last days. In Isaiah 11, the stem, a stump or rootstock, refers to scattered Israel, while both the rod and the root represent the future Messiah, the son of David. In Section 113, the stem, which is the origin or source of the rod, represents Christ, while the rod and the root represent Christ's servant in the last days, the prophet Joseph Smith. As we saw with Section 86, the interpretations in Isaiah 11 and Doctrine and Covenants 113 are both perfectly legitimate. Which one you use depends on the context in which you are applying it, Isaiah's time or Joseph Smith's time. This is what the Book of Mormon prophet Nephi called likening all scriptures unto us, that it might be for our profit and learning, something which Nephi himself did with many of Isaiah's prophecies. Finally, let's discuss Joseph Smith's revelation about the Apocrypha, now Section 91. This revelation was received in Kirtland on the 9th of March, 1833. The English word Apocrypha comes from the Greek apokryphos, referring to something that is hidden. Apocryphal writings are texts whose origin, authorship, and authenticity have been questioned. When used in a Judeo-Christian context, the term Apocrypha refers to a text that has been considered scripture by a distinct group or groups of believers, but has not been accepted as authoritative or canon by most believers. There are hundreds of apocryphal texts that have been accepted by various Jewish and Christian groups over the centuries, but have been considered spurious by most Christian believers. The Apocrypha, with the definite article, refers to 14 specific scriptural books written in Greek during the period between the Old and New Testaments. These books are accepted by some Christian denominations, most notably Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christians, but have not been included in the canon of most Protestant churches. The 14 books of the Apocrypha are 1st Esdras, 2nd Esdras, Tobit, Judith, additions to the book of Esther, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, Baruch and the Epistle of Jeremiah, the Prayer of Manasseh, 1st Maccabees, 2nd Maccabees, and 3 additions to the book of Daniel, the Prayer of Azariah and Song of the Three Holy Children, Susanna, and Bel and the Dragon. Joseph Smith's King James Bible included the Apocrypha between the Old and New Testaments. When Joseph came to the Apocrypha toward the end of his Bible translation project, he inquired of the Lord if he should translate these books. He was told that they contained much truth, but also some spurious, uninspired writings. Therefore, it was not necessary for him to translate them. That concludes this lesson. If you enjoyed it, please click the thumbs up button and leave a comment below. Please subscribe if you'd like to be notified when new lessons are posted to this channel, and visit www.huarc.org to download these notes and this slideshow. In our next lesson, we'll discuss Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon's magnificent vision of the 3 degrees of glory in God's heavenly kingdom. The reading is Doctrine and Covenants, section 76. See you next week.